And welcome back. Today we're going to be diving into the gritty tale of Eugene Weidmann, the petty thief cum serial killer who won the hearts of hundreds of beautiful French women. But to find out why this serial killer will go down forever in French history, and how the famous actor Christopher Lee, who you may remember from such films as Sleepy Hollow, Dracula, The Rainbow Thief, and The Girl from Nagasaki, became involved in this tale. It's Saturday, November the 27th, 1937, and Raymond Le Sobre leaves his estate agency to do a quick routine house visit with a new client. He tells his secretary that he will be back very shortly, but when he's still not back in the evening, she starts to become worried, so she contacts the police. The police come by and ask a couple of simple questions, one being where his last visit was. She rifles through the information and finds exactly where he was going to, and they go to check it out. When the police arrive at the address, what they find is Mr. Le Sobre lying on his face in the basement. He has been shot dead in the back of the neck. The investigation for the murder of Raymond Le Sobre begins. His secretary informs the police that he had been with a man with a German accent, and the man had left a business card. Arthur Schott. In this business card, it has all of his contact information, so the police immediately go to the address of Arthur Schott. Now, the murder of Raymond Le Sobre was in a region really near Paris. Arthur Schott lived in Alsace, near the German border, somewhat far away. And he had a solid alibi. It completely checked out with many witnesses. So it wasn't him. The police therefore ask him how his business card ended up in the estate agent of a man who has just been murdered. He thinks for a second. He's just had his business cards printed. Not many people have them. But he did give a copy to his nephew, Fritz Frommer, who lived in Paris. The police had a lead. Arthur gives the police the address of his nephew, Fritz. And the police go to the address. He lives in a kind of hotel. They ask the receptionist if Fritz Frommer does indeed live in this hotel. The receptionist says yes, he does, but he hasn't been here for the last 8 days. 8 days. It has been indeed 8 days since Raymond Le Sobre was murdered. The police are onto something, so they call back Arthur to ask more information about his nephew Fritz. When they call him back, Arthur lets them know that Fritz has a private secretary who he refers to as Carrère. Carrère has a house in La Celle-Saint-Cloud, which is a little village near Paris. The police send 2 officers to check out the address. When the 2 officers get to the address of Carrère in La Celle-Saint-Cloud, they ring the doorbell, but nobody's home. In the driveway, however, they see 2 cars. And both cars have the same number plate. They find this relatively suspicious, particularly because one of the cars is the exact same make and model as that of Raymond Le Sobre, the poor man who has just been killed. This is enough information for them to decide to stay and wait for the homeowner to come back. It's a good thing they wait, because pretty soon after, they see an elegantly dressed man coming out of an alleyway and walking towards the house. He sees them, but does not seem fazed. He stops, in fact, to stroke a neighborhood dog. As he approaches, the police ask, "We're looking for a Mr. Carrère." "That's me," he says. Carrère calmly asks them who they are. They don't want to give away their position just yet, so they tell him they are with the tax inspection company. He invites them inside, and once they are in his living room, he asks them if he can see their tax ID. Now, they don't have tax inspector ID because they're police. So instead, they have been foiled and they pull out their police badges. They ask him in favor, "Can we see your ID?" He reaches slowly into his jacket pocket and pulls out a gun and starts shooting at the 2 police officers, yelling, "Voilà mes papiers," which means, "Here's my papers." Now, Carrère shoots multiple times, hitting both of the police officers. One of them takes a bullet to his shoulder. They are unprepared and unarmed. They try to fight back and tackle him to the ground, but it is a struggle. One of them grabs a hammer and whacks him across the head. He's knocked out. They cuff him and call for backup. Somehow, luckily, they both survive the attack. Carrère is brought into the police station under the suspicion of having murdered Raymond Le Sobre. Along with finding the car, which was identified later as the car of Raymond Le Sobre, in the driveway of Carrère, they also find an engraved lighter with RL and multiple paper identity cards with the face of Carrère, but all under different names. They find 2 revolvers as well. Now, there is quite a lot of evidence piled up against Carrère, so the head of the police, Inspector Cisco, comes in to question him. They begin the interrogation showing him the gun in which he has used to shoot at the police. They ask, "Do you recognize this weapon?" Carrère tilts his head calmly, relatively emotionless, and that's about as much cooperation as he gives. They ask many more questions like this, but get a very similar response to each of the questions. He begins to get mad at the man in front of him, who has shot at his men and committed a murder. Eventually, Carrère says, "Let me sleep, and I'll tell you everything tomorrow." The Inspector Cisco, who is really getting nowhere anyway, decides that this is not that bad an idea and brings Carrère in the following day for questioning one more time. This time, Carrère tells the police everything, beginning with his real name, Eugene Weidmann. And surprisingly, he's happy to talk. And it seems as if a weight has been lifted off of his shoulders. So Eugene explains to the police that he had a relatively nice upbringing from a relatively wealthy family in Germany. His dad fought in World War I and his mum owned a restaurant. But he was a thief. He began to steal at a young age and couldn't stop. He stole and stole and stole, but the police don't care about this because he's just committed a murder and they want to get to the point. So they hurry him through the details and ask him why he murdered Raymond Le Sobre. He said it was for convenience. He needed a bit of money and he thought it was easy. They ask what he means by convenience. Well, Eugene had walked into the village and seen an estate agent. He walked in thinking it was an easy target and booked a rendezvous with the man, planning to kill him and steal all the money that he had on him. For this murder, he got 5,000 francs, which is roughly $800, a gold lighter, and a car. When Weidmann is telling the police why he committed this murder, he seems completely emotionless. He suddenly breaks into tears and is a mess, yelling about his poor, poor mother and how she's gonna suffer for his actions. The police, being nice, decide to tell him that if he wants to continue with the confession, he can write down his confession rather than talking if it's too hard. The first thing that Eugene writes on the paper is very unexpected for the police. Jeanne de Coven. Immediately, they recognize her name as the young American dancer who went missing 5 months previous. She disappeared with no suspects and no trace. Jeanne de Coven was a young American who had come to Paris with her aunt and was staying in a quite luxurious hotel. She went down to the hotel bar for a drink, and this is where she met Eugene Weidmann. He seems well-dressed, charming, educated, and he invites her for dinner. She is very excited, so she asks her aunt. Her aunt does indeed seem a little bit worried, but she lets her go anyway. Since that day, nobody has seen her. There was, however, a ransom note, but it was a ransom note for 500 francs, which is roughly $80. Nobody would kidnap someone and ask for such a ridiculously small amount, so nobody took it seriously. Now, when the police look into this, they assume that she has run off because she's fallen in love with this handsome German man. This is relatively typical of French culture. They're so obsessed with romance and love, and so I can see why they would jump to this conclusion rather than starting an investigation. However, with pressure from the family and from the American embassy, they do open an investigation. Because, however, they think that she's run away with the love of her life, they really don't look that hard into it. Eugene Weidmann's modus operandi. He was looking for rich people to rob, so he goes to the fancy hotel bar and waits for his prey. Jeanne de Coven comes and sits next to him in the hotel bar, and this for him is easy. I'm imagining Emily in Paris when I think of Jean. She is a young American who's just come over to Paris and she's super enthusiastic about everything. She excitedly tells him about the things she loves about Paris. Les rues, du vin, les magasins. He asks her why she's come to Paris, and she tells him she's there for the International Exhibition of Art and Technology, which is a huge global event that was held that year in France. And she tells him that she has arrived by boat on the SS Normandy. This boat is super fascinating. The SS Normandy was built in Saint-Nazaire for transatlantic crossings. This boat has a little bit of a fascinating story. It was actually seized by the Americans in World War II with the intention of converting it into a troop ship, but during the conversions it caught fire and sunk to the bottom of the Hudson River and was never used again. The point is that only someone with money could afford to go on the SS Normandy, and so for Eugene that meant he'd found his prey. Now, Eugene fabricated a story about how he was some kind of important man and told her he would love to show her around Paris. She was delighted with the idea of being shown around Paris by someone who knew Paris, and not only that, he was German. So she didn't even question the fact that she might be in danger. He tells her he needs to go back to his house to get his car, and so she comes with him. When they get to the house, she is so enthusiastic to have a tour all the way around and see absolutely everything. He gives her a drink and slips her chloral hydrate, which was a sleep medication but also used for sedation. Now she falls into a deep sleep, but so does he. And when he wakes up, she is rifling through his clothing, now suspicious that she is in danger, to search for his gun. He jumps on her, and at that moment, he strangles her. Now, the strange thing about all of this is that when he tells the police exactly where he buried her in his back garden, he breaks down once again and begs them not to take him back there for him to see the crime that he committed. In fact, he had actually even placed roses on the grave that he dug for her after murdering her. Police do not believe him. The fact is that this man has admitted to committing 2 murders for a ridiculously small amount of money, and he seems completely overwhelmed with the fact that he has murdered 2 people. The police find this somewhat suspicious and start to begin to wonder if he was a spy. At that time, World War I had just finished and we were not that far away from World War II, and so there were a whole bunch of German and Polish refugees already living in France, hundreds of which were probably spies for their own countries. Not only was he German, but he had also spent time in a German prison when he was younger for a small theft he had committed, and he was released by the Gestapo. Was he working for the Nazis? So, beginning to suspect that he was some form of a spy, they begin to question him further. Why did he come to France? He states that he had met 2 Frenchmen in the German prison. They were named Roger Million and John Blanc. They became quite good friends and they made a plan to meet in Paris. Their plan was to kidnap rich tourists and ask for ransom money. They took some time in doing some research and they kidnapped their first victim, which went horribly wrong because it was a relatively strong man that managed to overpower them and escape. But then they changed their strategy. They would look for weaker people. The police look into his comrades a little bit further just to make sure that there is no real spy situation going on, and they do discover that there really is nothing to suggest political espionage. At this moment in the investigation, Eugene writes 3 further names down on the piece of paper: Joseph Cuffy, Robert LeBlanc, and Fritz Fromer. Immediately, the chief inspector recognizes these names. They are all murder victims. Now, this makes 5 potential murders from one man, including the estate agent and the dancer. With these 3 names, that's 5. But Eugene is calm and ready to accept his punishment and tells the police everything about all of the murders. Joseph Cuffy was a limousine driver that you could hire for the day to take you to far places or to have an extravagant event. And so Eugene hired Joseph Cuffy. He hired him and he shot him, and all for the sum of 1,400 francs and the limousine. Roughly $250 and a limousine. Now, Roger Leblanc was an impresario, and Eugene actually stated that he did not kill Roger Leblanc, although he was obviously implicated in the planning of it, but it was actually his comrade Million who killed him. And they got away with, this time, 5,000 francs, which is roughly $800, which they split between them. And the last on the list is Fritz Fomer. Now, Fritz Fomer, if you remember this name, he was actually the nephew of Arthur Schutt. So he was the guy who kind of ended up leading the police to Eugene Weidmann in the first place, ironically, because Eugene Weidmann had actually killed Fritz Fomer for this very reason. He was concerned that Fritz was getting too close and too involved, and he knew too much, and he was worried that he would lead the police to him, which evidently he did. And suddenly, Eugene remembers one last name that he had forgot to add to the list. Janine Keller. He had lured Janine Keller in with the promise of hiring her as a nurse. She had been shot in the back of the neck, like every other victim of his. And he walked away with 100 francs, which you can guess by now is absolutely nothing, and a diamond ring. So altogether, there were 6 murders piled against Eugene Weidmann, and all for such small and pathetic amounts of money. He had become a serial killer, and he was about to go down in history. So his picture was published in the paper, and it was the picture of him with a bandage around his head from where he'd been whacked by the police with the hammer during the whole situation in the house where they had caught him and he had shot at them. And the picture went 1930s equivalent of viral. He was dubbed the Velvet-Eyed Killer because he was this handsome German man with a mysterious charm, and the French women fell in love with him. Not only that, because of the media surrounding the situation, lawyers were offering up their services for his court trial. During his time in prison, women were writing him love letters, even asking for his hand in marriage. But even with his newfound fame, the judge did not go easy on him, and he was sentenced to a public execution death. There had, of course, been these rumors circulating that he was connected to the Nazi party, and that may have made his sentence heavier, but he was also a serial killer. So on the morning of the 17th of June 1939, just a couple of months before World War II begins, Eugene is prepared and dressed for his execution. There are multiple sources which state that he was notably calm. Now, his execution was scheduled for the morning. There were journalists, the women that had fallen madly in love with him, there were rowdy drunk people, but there were a lot of people. It was a huge crowd, and even people in the houses around about where the guillotine was placed had started renting out their properties to journalists just so that they could get the best picture. This had become a media spectacle. The rowdy and somewhat drunk crowd start chanting, "Commencez! Commencez!" Among these rowdy, drunk Parisian people stands a young Sir Christopher Lee, about to lay witness to this absolutely horrific scene. Now, you may be thinking that this incident potentially could have had some influence on Sir Christopher Lee's somewhat horror-heavy film career. He does actually even address this incident in his autobiography. When the guillotine finally comes down, crazed women break through the police barrier and dip their handkerchiefs in Eugene's blood, believing that it will somehow help them with fertility. Although public executions were banned from that moment onward, private executions did continue until 1977 in France, when they were finally also banned. Voila, that sums up our story for this week, and I hope that has given you your fill of gritty French culture for one more week. If you want to check out our previous video, go and check out the link over here, and if you feel like subscribing, then you can too. That's all for this week. Thank you, merci, au revoir.